it's Becky from Becky Writes. This is Becky Reads, and this is finally my November wrap-up video. November was supposed to be a pretty slow month for me, because I was supposed to be participating in NaNoWriMo, and as y'all know, I failed. After the national election, my creativity shriveled up like my hope, and I just couldn't be creative anymore. I'm slowly crawling out of that hole, but I have been stress baking for the last week and a half. But I did manage to get 7 books read, which is almost double what I had anticipated reading in November, so let's just jump right in. This was the month of mostly nonfiction. I only read 3 fiction items this month, which is unusual. Normally I read more fiction than nonfiction, but that wasn't a bad thing. I wasn't officially participating in nonfiction November, but it just kind of worked out that way. 2 of the books I read this month are books about a hobby that I love and I'm slowly getting back into, and that is sort of gardening and urban homesteading skills. To that end, I read the ebook Vertical Gardening by Gloria. This was okay. I gave it 3 stars. It was a fairly decent introduction. If you know anything about gardening, it's not the greatest, but it was like $2 on Amazon Kindle, so I read it on my trip to England. And the second one I got in that little bundle deal with Vertical Gardening was called Urban Homesteading by Jennifer Ross. This one was not that great. I gave it 2.5 stars. Honestly, if you have any experience in the urban homesteading movement at all, or you've read some blogs, this is not informative. It is just way too basic to be that useful. It's not full of bad information, it's just super basic, and I suspect anybody who's interested will just Google urban homesteading and like find great blogs that are just as good or better and free than this book. Alright, so those are the 2 sort of hobby-related nonfiction books that I read. I also listened to 3 audiobooks this month. The first audiobook I listened to was H is for Hawk by Helen McDonald. H is for Hawk is an interesting story because it is supposed to be like a memoir of Helen McDonald dealing with the grief that her father's sudden death sort of left her behind, and as she was dealing with the grief of losing her father, she decides to train a goshawk. Now, she's already trained birds before. She's trained falcons and is sort of a historian of like birding, but this is her first time training a hawk, and she's intimidated by the process. The book really looks at the whole training process and her emotional connection to the hawk, and I have to say that on a sentence level, her writing is incredible. It's evocative when she's on the moors and she's describing her hawk and the way it swoops and dives and how it reacts to her. I found it really moving and touching and engrossing, and I felt that I was there with her. And so on that level, this book is beautiful and really engaging. But it has some problems too. I have to say there were 2 things that kind of knocked points off for me, and I think are reasons people have not loved this book. The first one is that it's not really about grief. It's really about the hawk training with a little bit of grief sprinkled in. The grief is the context, but with the exception of the very beginning, the very end, and one spot about 2/3 of the way through the story, her grief about her dad isn't even mentioned. It is so not a part of the story. Now, I get that the grieving process often deals with a lot of denial. This is a memoir about grief, or it's couched as a memoir about grief, and it's not actually about grief. The grief isn't really integral to the story she's telling. It's the setup rather than the main thrust of the memoir. The second critique I have of this is that she is doing a lot of comparison between her own experience of training a goshawk and the experience of E.B. White, who is most well known for writing The Once and Future King about King Arthur, but also wrote a memoir about training a goshawk called The Goshawk. While I think that could have been done well, it's way too heavy-handed, and she also is comparing her experience to several men of the medieval period, and I think it just tries to do too many things at once. Her writing is good. She's just all over the place in a way that doesn't actually work for the memoir she's writing. Overall, I gave it a 4 star. I would say it's somewhere between 3.5 and 4 stars because the writing is just beautiful. I really enjoyed her on a sentence-by-sentence level. Some of the best writing I feel like I've read all year, but on the other side, I felt like it was scattered. So depending upon what you have a tolerance for, if you love language, I think you'll enjoy this and be able to forgive her for her scatteredness, but if something that's not completely organized bothers you, then I would give it a skip. The next audiobook I read was The Geek Feminist Revolution by Kameron Hurley. I really enjoyed this and gave it 4 out of 5 stars. Now, I've never read any of Kameron Hurley's work. She is a science fiction fantasy author who is known for writing worlds in which sexuality is totally different than we have in our world. Basically, things are just non-binary in her world. People have all kinds of different sexual relationships. There's multiple kinds of gender. It's just a very different society. I have never read any of that stuff, so it was interesting to read this nonfiction piece by her because I was so unfamiliar with any of her actual fiction writing. I have to say, I really enjoyed it, but it reminded me of how little I know about the science fiction and fantasy communities. Like, I'd never heard of the sad puppygate situation. It helped fill in some gaps about my own knowledge of the science fiction and fantasy online communities and the literature communities, and it reminds me of how much a noob I am as far as wanting to be a published author in those communities, but I did enjoy it. I will say that if you aren't into science fiction and fantasy particularly, and literature especially, this book is probably not going to be able to speak to you because she relies so heavily on a particular kind of geek trope. So if you are more of a sciencey geek or like an environmental geek or something, and your science fiction and fantasy aren't your ways of identifying as a geek, you're not going to get as many of the references that she uses. That being said, I still found it really valuable. I enjoyed her conversations about fatness and health, and it broke my heart when she was talking about how important Obamacare has been for her as someone who's insulin dependent, knowing that our new future president wants to get rid of Obamacare. I mean, I was listening to it while walking home from work and I almost cried while I was walking home. So it's a poignant collection of essays that range from very funny to very serious and specifically look at the experience of women online in science fiction and fantasy, but really do range on a whole host of topics. And that's it! I actually kept saying that I read 3 audiobooks this month. I only read 2. I was reading my notes wrong. The last 3 books I read this month were my 3 fiction reads. The first one was Nimona by Noelle Stevenson. I checked this out from a library. It finally came in. I had it on hold for like 2 months. There were so many people who wanted to read it. I finally got it. I'm very excited. I enjoyed this. I thought it was cute. I wasn't expecting it to go where it went. I thought that it was a really good story about morals. This is something I would want to give to like a preteen, actually. I think it did a really good job of having us question who are good guys and who are bad guys and what causes people to hurt. I ended up giving it 4 out of 5 stars. I just really enjoyed this. It's a good fairy tale, I guess is what I'm trying to say. It has a little bit of a rocky beginning because, you know, it started as a webcomic, but it really picks up about 2 or 3 episodes in, and I really enjoyed it. Then I read The Lightning Thief by Riordan. This is my first time reading any of the Percy Jackson books, and I had a good time with this. I gave this a 4 star. It was just fun. It was just a fun read. It was a little bit, you know, monster of the moment. Every chapter, a new little monster to fight, but if you're talking about writing for 10 and 11-year-olds, that's a really good chapter by chapter way of getting them engaged, keeping them engaged as you have them build into the characters. I enjoyed this. I get why people love Rick Riordan. He's just fun and he's silly, and you know, on my best days I hope to write a middle grade that has this much humor and also some depth. I can see how these characters are going to develop over the next 4 books, so I am hoping to pick up the rest of the books. And for those of you who don't know, Lightning Thief is about Percy Jackson, who discovers that he is half Greek god, that the Greek gods are still real, and that he is to battle monsters and complete a quest in order to sort of survive in the human world, and it's a good one. It's definitely a good one. And finally, the last fiction book that I read this month, I loved. I've done a spoiler-free review, so I'll link it down below, and that is Some Kind of Happiness by LeGrand. I just loved this book, and I gave it 4.5 stars. Really, it's like a 4.75. I don't generally give quarter stars. It's almost a 5 star. This is almost a perfect book. There's a couple places where the pacing just gets off by a hair, and I was gonna ignore them, but if I'm being honest, the pacing does just get off like a half a beat. But aside from that, at the very end, this is great. This is the story of a girl named Finley who is dropped off with some family she doesn't know, and in uncovering the secrets, she also has to wrestle with the fact that she deals with depression and anxiety. This was beautiful, and this is the kind of book I wish I could have read at 13 or 14. I think it would have given me language to articulate my own anxiety and my own stress in a way that I'd never known was real. I didn't know until I was like in college some of the stuff about anxiety that would have really helped me be able to communicate to my teachers and my family. I loved this. I thought it was beautiful. It was a beautifully written book. This is a book that I think a 12-year-old could read easily and a 40-year-old could read and still get something out of it and still enjoy it. Alright friends, those are the 7 books I got through this month. Not bad considering my goal had been to be reading 4, so I definitely increased my reading. My end of November year-to-date reading total was 122 books read. Can you believe that? 122 books read in 1 year. That's bonkers. My goal was to read 100 books. I am just astounded at the amount of reading I've gotten done. So comment down below and let me know how your reading year has been so far, and if you have a favorite book of the month. Without fail, my favorite book of this month is Some Kind of Happiness by Claire LeGrand. Hope you guys are all doing well. I'm sorry that this was a late video. I have just not been in a very creative place, but I'm getting back to it, friends. I'm getting back to it. Happy holidays for those of you who are getting ready to celebrate winter holidays, and I will talk to you all very soon. Bye!